In a recent video, I touched on the subject of sexual assault in prison. I've decided that I want to devote more time to that subject because this is something which people who don't know anything about it spend far too much time talking about. And people who have been in the environments where it might occur, people who actually know the truth, tend to not talk about it. As a result, there's a lot of misinformation. Bear in mind, I can only speak to what I personally saw, what I experienced. There are dozens of prisons in California, over 100 yards, and I was only housed on a couple of these places. Each yard, each building has its own flavor, its own social structure and dynamic. As a result, I can't tell you what happened everywhere in CDC. That would be crazy. I can tell you what I saw. Moreover, I can only speak to the group I was a part of. The Woods, the skinheads, all of the white guys clumped together into one ethnic group. This is the group that I was a member of. I can tell you about the policies of the whites. I can tell you what was done. I don't know how the blacks conducted their business, how the Hispanics or the others conducted theirs. I wouldn't have asked and they wouldn't have told me because it would have been none of my business. Finally, there were two distinct types of yards that I was housed on. There were the general population yards that were high security. This is high desert where there are rules in place and everybody follows them. There's a structure. And there were the SNY yards. These were lower security yards where everybody kind of did what they wanted and there was no gang structure in place, at least nothing that you had to join. High desert, the level 4 yard that I was housed on for about 5 years, there was absolutely no sexual assault that I heard of, ever. You have to understand, rules were strictly enforced here. If you violated a rule, it could mean your life. One of the rules was the hands-off policy. What this means is that if you have a problem with your cellie, let's imagine you caught your cellie stealing from you, you cannot put your hands on him. Because if the two of you get into a fight, it could result in you going to the hole or one of you being injured, and that would diminish the gang's capacity to participate in a riot. As a result, if you want to put hands on somebody, you have to go to the shot callers and tell them, I caught my cellie stealing from me and I want to go beat him up. And they'll go off to the side and have a conversation about whether or not they're going to allow you to beat up your cellie. If you violate this rule, it again can mean your life. They might have you stabbed over it, they might have you beaten severely. The idea that inmates are routinely going to the shot callers and saying, hey, I've been thinking about it and I want to rape my cellie and I want you guys to give me permission, is intrinsically absurd. This doesn't make any sense. Remember, these are guys who, whenever a rapist or a child molester steps foot on the yard, he is immediately assaulted and perhaps even killed because of what he did. The idea that they as a group are granting permission for sexual assaults to happen behind closed doors doesn't make any sense. After I left High Desert, I became an SNY inmate, and you have to understand that while there are still gangs in the SNY yards, you don't have to join them. It's more like the Wild West, where anything goes and people do what they want. If you want to get into a fight with somebody, you don't ask for permission. You walk up and punch that person in the face, or more likely, you hit them in the back of the head with something. However, people on these yards have all told on somebody to get there. You generally don't reach an SNY yard without being to some degree a rat or a snitch. As a result, there is a lot of cop involvement in any kind of violent incident, any kind of gang activity. I recall an instance where there was a big guy and a little guy arguing with each other, and generally you'd expect the little guy to be intimidated and back down. The big guy puffed out his chest, you don't want to mess with me, I'll beat you within an inch of your life. And the little guy puffed his chest right back and said, I'll go tell right now, the cops will have you in the hole. And the big guy backed down because the little guy was right. All he had to do was start yelling, hey, this guy's intimidating me, and the cops are going to get involved, and likely the big guy would have gotten taken to the hole over it. This isn't to say that there's no wrongdoing on these yards. There's still violence, there's still rule breaking and drug use. This is a prison. But it's generally very covert, and there are some things that just aren't done. One of the things that simply isn't done is violent sexual assault. If somebody were violently sexually assaulted behind closed doors, it would be expected he'd go and tell the cops, and there would be an investigation. Or perhaps even a third party would go and tell the cops, and there would be an investigation. They have it written in the rules that an inmate can allege that somebody else has been sexually assaulted, and that's all it takes. There will be an investigation done. Quickly, too. The rule is 48 hours to conduct and complete the investigation. That is incredibly fast by prison standards. You have to understand that while the media may portray it as the officers not caring about this type of thing, in fact, the investigative procedure is very thorough. They will do interviews with everybody who might have any information about this. The alleged victim and the alleged assaultant, their neighbors perhaps, people who might have seen into the cell, the guy's friends. They'll do a lot of interviews. They'll have medical staff do physical examinations of both parties to see if perhaps there's physical evidence. And then once the investigation is done, they'll have a hearing to determine if, in fact, a sexual assault occurred. If you're found guilty of committing a sexual assault in prison, the penalties are harsh. Not only can it be referred to the district attorney and you can actually be charged with a crime as if you had committed it on the streets, but there will be a hearing within the prison grounds. This is not a hearing where there's a high standard of proof. They don't need to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't need a jury of your peers to convict you. They have a lieutenant look at the evidence, the investigation that was done, and determine if there is a preponderance of evidence that you committed sexual assault. This means he thinks it probably happened. Probably is a real low standard. All he really needs is maybe a little bit of physical evidence, a couple of people saying it did. And the penalties within prison are harsh too. They actually treat it as harshly as if you had committed a murder while in prison. You will be placed on single cell status probably for the rest of your life. You will never have a cellie again. You will never be alone with another inmate you could sexually assault. As a result of this, I'm sure that sexual assaults do occasionally happen in CDC. I never heard of one or saw one, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I mean, this is a system where there are violent felons and sexual predators. Of course, terrible things happen. But the idea that these things happen routinely, that nobody cares, is simply not true. If somebody did it just once, they'd probably get caught and then make it so they could never do it again. I realize that it's easy to have an opinion about this, that because it's happening to inmates, nobody should care. After all, they did terrible things, and they're getting their just desserts whenever they're sexually assaulted. But you have to bear in mind that in this hypothetical scenario where an inmate is assaulted, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Somebody is assaulting him. And odds are good that person is going to eventually be released out onto the streets. He could be your neighbor. He could be the guy that you see walking down the street. It is very important to us as a society that it not be allowed for these people to think that sexual assault will not be punished in any environment. It's always a monstrous thing. I finally want to talk about something besides violent, forced sexual assault, and that's coerced sexual assault. And this does happen, not just in prison, but in a lot of environments. The classic example is that a criminally sophisticated inmate, a predator, might find some new guy, a young kid just starting in the system, and give him some drugs or some food or some booze or whatever he thought that the guy would take. And then once the guy has taken a certain amount, he says, "Hey, are you going to pay me for those drugs? You know you owe me $100, right?" And the implied threat of force, the social leverage of the debt, allows him to coerce his victim into providing sexual favors. This type of thing does happen, and a lot of people don't think of it as rape. It is absolutely a monstrous assault, no different from forced violent sexual assault, and it ruins people's lives. There is a set of videos that were produced as part of the PREA Act. That's the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was authored by Tom Cahill, a prison rights activist who was involved tangentially in my criminal case. What this did is that it caused the rules and laws across the nation to be normalized and standardized regarding how sexual assault in prison should be investigated and how it should be punished. One of the things that this law did is that it created the infamous candy bar video, which I'm going to have to do a video on in the near future because it is just the perfect example of good-intentioned nonsense. It's my opinion this video has caused far more sexual assault than it has prevented in CDC, and I think that it should be talked about. I wanted to spend just one more minute talking about coercion. Coercion is the means by which sexual assault does happen in prison and often out here on the streets. A predator creates a situation in which his victim feels like it's easier to go along with things that he is uncomfortable with, things that he knows are wrong, than it would be to stand up for himself, to stand up for his rights. Always stand up for what you know is right, or you'll find yourself going down that slippery slope where other people are deciding for you who you are.